Theodore Robert Cowell, later known as Ted Bundy, was born November 24, 1946 to his mother Louise Cowell and a man suspected to be named Jack Worthington. Louise was left as a single mother and soon moved to Philadelphia with her mother, father, and sisters. At the age of 3, Ted Bundy's actions were already raising red flags. An aunt of his remembered even as a toddler, Ted would do strange things such as place knives around her while she was sleeping. Further on into his youth, Bundy would learn to steal things to get what he wanted. Growing up in a household where money was tight, petty theft quickly became something he'd do often, a habit which extended into his adulthood. Unknown to his friends and family, Ted Bundy had developed a mask of sanity. On the outside, he was charming, articulate, he knew what to say and when to say it. Bundy was admired by many, but on the inside, he was cold and calculated. There was an insatiable bloodlust within him that craved the suffering of other human beings. This would ultimately lead him to become one of the world's most notorious serial killers, eventually confessing to murdering 30 people. Even with that, the estimated kill count is much higher, some experts believing it to be in the hundreds. That is what we will be exploring today, Ted Bundy's infamous killing spree in full graphic detail. In this video, I'll only be focusing on the confirmed kills. But before I start, let me know in the comment section what serial killer or true crime case I should focus on next. And with that, let's begin. Karen Sparks. At approximately 2 a.m. on January 4th, 1974, Karen Sparks, sometimes referred to as Terry Codwell, turned off her television set and went to bed. Through the night, Karen would spot an older man watching her through her bedroom window. Believing she was paranoid, she brushed it off as nothing, something that would change her life. Sometime after this, Bundy would enter her home, creeping toward her. Once he was close enough, he would violently strike her over the head with a metal rod, leaving blood splattering all over her bed. With Karen's face bloody and swollen from the beating, Bundy inserted the same metal rod into her genitals so far that it split her bladder. According to Karen Sparks, the only reason Bundy didn't kill her is because her roommate happened to talk in his sleep. She believes that this saved her life. Even then, she would be left unconscious for at least 20 hours before one of her roommates came to check on her. Bundy had beaten her so badly that she was left in a coma for 10 days. She would live, but would never make a full recovery. She would suffer permanent brain damage which affected her vision and hearing. For years, she suffered from a constant ringing in her ears and epileptic fits. Bundy would learn from this. Going forward, he would take his victims to an isolated location rather than perform his serial killings where there were people who could stop him. Linda Ann Healy. In the mid-1970s, Linda Ann Healy studied psychology at the University of Washington. Outside of this, she worked at a radio station where she reported the weather. On January 31st, 1974, her day started and ended just like any other. She arrived home around midnight after having drinks with friends at a local bar. During that same night, Ted Bundy would walk up the steps of her home and attempt to open the door. Unfortunately for Linda, she had left it unlocked. And with that, her fate was sealed. Unknown to her, Ted had been stalking her for some time. Hours later, Ted would break into the home, eventually making his way down to the basement where Linda slept. It was here that he bashed her skull in with a crowbar. Blood poured from her wounds, seeping into her nightgown and pillow. Not wanting to make it obvious that she was dead, he changed her into a t-shirt and jeans, hanging her bloody nightgown in the closet. He then cleaned up the evidence around the room. Police would later be thrown off by this, thinking the blood in the room was from a nosebleed. After finishing, he carried Linda outside and into his car, driving off into the night with her body. In 1975, her severed head and lower jawbone were found at Taylor Mountain. The rest of her has never been found. Before I continue, I wanted to introduce my novel, The Junkyard Kids, which is available on Amazon. Currently only 99 cents for the ebook version, your purchase does directly support myself and this channel. In the novel, we follow a mentally unstable misfit as he attempts to protect his brother in an urban wasteland. Further on into the story, we find out the reason the two are homeless is due to their parents being stabbed to death by a serial killer. Over 10 years later, when the protagonist is in his early 20s, he groups up with 3 other unwanted outcasts. All of them decide to live on the outskirts of town in an abandoned junkyard. After finally finding a home and some peace of mind, 2 thugs intrude into their home. When one of the thugs kills the other, our protagonist gets involved and ends up killing the murderer out of self-defense. He and his friends know no one will believe their story and soon dump the bodies in a local river. Realizing they'll be caught soon, the group decides to flee the city. However, their plans fall short when they discover clues to the identity of the serial killer. Deciding he wants justice for his parents, the protagonist ends up pursuing the sadistic madman. Unfortunately for him, the serial killer is well aware of the pursuit and begins a deadly game of cat and mouse. As Amazon reader Ivy says, it seems we are all one moment away from embracing the monster within. I needed and relished in the story of how each character became a junkyard kid. If this sounds good, check out the thumbnail at the end of this video. It'll bring you to a sample reading narrated by me. One last thing, if you buy the book and enjoy it, consider leaving a 5-star Amazon review. You may just see your review in one of my videos. And with that being said, let's continue. Donna Manson. On March 12, 1974, Donna Manson would leave her dorm room for a jazz concert on her college campus. Despite the distance between the 2 locations being a 2-minute walk, no one ever reported seeing her at the concert. In fact, no one ever reported seeing her again. Within that 2-minute span, she would seemingly disappear off the face of the earth. At the time, she was depressed and her disappearance would not be reported until almost a week later. This was due to the fact that she was known to hitchhike often by her roommates, so going off wasn't out of the ordinary. Not much information is known about the events from here on out, including the actual murder by Ted Bundy. However, it has been speculated that he lured her into his car by feigning an injury, a favorite of his. No trace of this victim has ever been found. Ted Bundy himself would later admit to her murder only days before being executed. After killing her, he allegedly buried her body on Taylor Mountain before burning her skull in the fireplace of his then girlfriend. He would then vacuum up her ashes. The problem with this is the temperature of a fire needs to be between 1500 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit to turn human bone to ash. The average temperature of a residential fireplace is around 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. Along with this, Ted Bundy was a pathological liar. Regardless of if this part of the story is true or not, no trace of this victim has ever been discovered. Susan Rincourt. On April 17, 1974, Susan Rincourt was doing her laundry on the Central Washington State College campus. At approximately 10 p.m., she crossed paths with Ted Bundy, who had his arm in a sling, an attempt to ruse an unsuspecting victim who unfortunately would be Susan. Ted requested she help him with the books he was carrying. She agreed. He led her to an isolated location where she wouldn't be seen. Once they were close enough to his VW Bug, Ted bashed her in the head with a crowbar. He then dragged her body into his vehicle, which had the passenger seat removed. Ted and his victim sped off into the night, driving on the I-90 toward Issaquah and onto an old logging road. It was here that she would be murdered by Bundy. The exact details of the murder were never revealed by him. However, some sources state that her skull was severely fractured. With that, it seems to be a likely possibility that she was bludgeoned to death with a crowbar. After the murder, Ted would decapitate her head, leaving it on Taylor Mountain with Linda. Roberta Parks. On May 6, 1974, Roberta Parks, a student at Oregon State University, was in the campus cafeteria. It being 11 p.m. was closing time, so very few people remained besides her. Sometime after, she ran into a friend named Lorraine Fargo, Roberta telling her she was out to get a hot fudge sundae. However, 3 hours later, she still hadn't returned. This was alarming because curfew for her dorms was 2 a.m. and Roberta was known to be responsible. The reason she hadn't returned was because she had been kidnapped by Ted Bundy and was in his VW bug en route to Washington State. It is speculated that she was kept alive during the trip and he killed her once he reached home. As with the others, her head was severed and dumped on Taylor Mountain, over 5 hours away from her home. At this time, both Oregon and Washington state authorities were well aware of a trend of missing women on college campuses in Seattle. With that being said, authorities in both areas were reluctant to lump this case in with the others due to the distance between them. Brenda Ball. In the morning hours of June 1st, 1974, Brenda Ball went missing from the Flame Tavern. There are two different accounts of what happened after she decided to leave. Account number 1. Brenda asked a male friend for a ride home but was told he was going off in a different direction. From here, she hitchhiked a ride and was eventually picked up by none other than Ted Bundy. Account number 2. Ted Bundy used his usual tactic of feigning an injury and lured her into his car. Regardless of how she got into the vehicle, the outcome is the same. Bundy would drive to a secluded area before murdering, dismembering, and leaving her severed head with the rest of the woman on Taylor Mountain. Georgianne Hawkins. Attending the University of Washington, Georgianne Hawkins, a sorority sister, disappeared on June 10, 1974. Before her disappearance, she had been studying for a Spanish test she had the next day. That is, until she went to a frat party later on in the evening with a friend. Georgianne had heard of the other girls going missing, never thinking that it would happen to her. Only it did. After leaving the party, Georgianne would have a conversation with a friend by the name of Duane Covey. Little did either of them know, Ted Bundy was watching their every movement. Soon, the conversation would end and Georgianne would be approached by Bundy, who was using crutches and wearing a fake leg cast. Bundy asked the girl for help, claiming he needed her to carry his briefcase to his car. Georgianne agreed to this and followed him down a dark alleyway. Upon reaching his car, Bundy would bash her in the skull with the crowbar before hoisting her into his vehicle. He then headed off to Issaquah. While in the vehicle, Georgianne woke up confused, thinking he was a tutor for her upcoming test. Bundy struck her again in the head with the crowbar, pulled her to a secluded area, and then strangled her to death. Janice Ott and Denise Nasland. On July 14, 1974, Janice Ott washed her clothes at the Suds Shop laundromat. Here, she would be invited out to coffee with the owner of the shop, to which she said yes. After this, Janice would travel by bicycle to the lake of a state park. Not long after putting on sunscreen, she would be approached by Ted Bundy, who claimed he needed help with his sailboat, which was in Issaquah. The two of them walked out of the park, where Janice would never be seen alive again. Hours later on that same day at the same location, Denise Nasland would exit the park bathroom. It was here that she ran into Ted Bundy, who convinced her to leave the park with him, possibly falling for the exact same excuse as Janice. Believing she would be back soon, she agreed. The location that Bundy took her is unknown, but is suspected to be somewhere in the woods. Regardless, when they arrived, Denise would be met face to face with Janice Ott, who Bundy had already repeatedly SA'd. Bundy then murdered both women one by one. Some sources state that after removing the heads of his victims with a hacksaw, Bundy would take the head back to his home, apply makeup to it, wash the hair, and then engage in sexual acts with it. Regarding this, he stated, "When you work hard to do something right, you don't want to forget it." Over 40,000 people attended the lake on that hot summer's day. Despite this, and the fact that the public was well aware of a man kidnapping young girls, Bundy was able to murder both of these women. Their skeletal remains would be discovered in a wooded area by two hunters 8 weeks later. Nancy Wilcox. On October 2nd, 1974, Nancy Wilcox walked down a dark street in Holiday, Utah. Unfortunately for her, the planets and stars aligned and she was in the direct sight of Ted Bundy. He stepped out his VW Bug and pulled out a knife, grabbing Nancy and forcing her into an orchard. Bundy attempted to remove her clothing, but she fought back. With this victim, he claimed that his only intention was to SA her. However, when she wouldn't stop fighting, he strangled her, having his way with her afterwards. Bundy stated he was unaware if she was dead or alive at this time. Several hours later, he returned to the orchard, knowing for certain that she was dead when he saw her still lying in the same spot. Bundy loaded her corpse into his car, later telling authorities that he left her in a rural location near Salt Lake City. No trace of Nancy has ever been found. Melissa Smith. On October 18th, 1974, Melissa Smith, daughter of a police chief, would be on her way to the sleepover of a friend. Unfortunately, when she called the friend, no one answered. Another friend called, inviting her out for pizza. She arrived to the restaurant around 9 p.m. before calling home and telling her sister she'd be home in around an hour. At approximately 10:15 p.m., a woman raking leaves would hear a piercing shriek. That shriek would be the last form of communication any human besides Bundy would ever hear from her. Around this time, it is speculated that Bundy, seeing Melissa walking home, pulled his vehicle over and attacked her with a crowbar. Like the others, he would drag her into his car before speeding off into the night. 9 days later, deer hunters would discover her disrobed body on a hillside near Summit Park. Detectives estimated the time of death to be approximately 36 hours from the time she had been discovered. This means Bundy may have kept her alive for a week or so in his apartment. Her hair had been washed, makeup had been applied to her face, fingernails painted, and her body was unusually clean. The sister of this victim would state that the makeup had not been applied by Melissa. Furthermore, a sock had been tightly wrapped around her neck. Heavy abrasions were found all over her body. There was also an injury to the back of her head. The damage of this injury was so extensive, detectives initially thought it was a bullet wound. Later on, it would be discovered that it was the blunt force trauma from Bundy's crowbar. Laura Aim. At midnight on Halloween of 1974, Laura Aim left a party in Orem, Utah. She then bought a pack of cigarettes before hitchhiking on Highway 89. From here, she would accept a ride from Ted Bundy in his VW Bug. The exact events that transpired after she entered his vehicle are officially unknown. However, according to an investigator from Colorado, Bundy brought Laura's unconscious body back to his apartment, cleaning her hair, applying makeup before SAing her. Sometime later, Bundy's crowbar would crack against her skull multiple times, leaving her dead. Laura's naked body would be found months later on a riverbank in the Wasatch Mountains. Her face had been brutally beaten and she had been strangled. Bundy had left her with a broken jaw and a fractured skull. Carol DeRonch. Around 6:30 p.m. on November 8, 1974, Carol DeRonch clocked out from her job at the Mountain Bell Telephone Company. She then went home and then headed off to the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah. It was here that Bundy would introduce himself to her as Officer Roseland, informing her that someone had broke into her vehicle. He then asked her to follow him. Once they arrived at the car, she noticed that nothing was off about it. Carol was then asked to come down to the station with Bundy, or in this case, Officer Roseland. The two walked through the mall and then across the street on the other side. It was there, Bundy told Carol that the suspect was being held at the police station and she needed to come and identify him. Once she got in his ride, she knew something was off when he immediately headed the opposite direction of the police station. Eventually, he would pull over and attempt to handcuff her. However, during the struggle, he would mistakenly place both cuffs on the same wrist. Carol left the car. At this point, Bundy came at her with his crowbar, pinning her against his vehicle. Luckily, Carol was able to escape, running down the road until an elderly couple picked her up and brought her to the police station. Deborah Kent. On the same day as Carol DeRonch, Deborah Kent, a 17-year-old high school senior, left to play at her school to pick up her younger brother from a roller skating rink. While leaving the auditorium, she was spotted by Ted Bundy. Bundy sprinted to catch up to her, soon overpowering her. 2 screams were heard by witnesses around this time. Unfortunately, no one actually saw anything due to the pitch blackness of night. Soon, he knocked her unconscious and threw her into the back of his car. With this victim, I was unable to find any information on whether or not Bundy used any manipulation tactics as he had with his previous victims, or if he simply attacked her. If it was the latter, he may have been frustrated from earlier in the day when Carol escaped. Regardless, he would eventually speed off into the night. As with some of his previous victims, it is unknown what happened after this. Ted Bundy would later admit to this murder, telling authorities he had dumped her body in the Fairview Canyon. After a search, they would find a woman's kneecap. It wasn't until 2015 that a DNA test was performed on the human remains. Once the test results came back, the DNA was found to match Deborah's. Karen Campbell. On January 12th of 1975, Karen Campbell, a nurse from Michigan, would find herself on the 2nd floor of the Wildwood Inn down in Snowmass, Colorado. While walking down the hallway, she happened to look out the window toward the heated pool. It was there she spotted Ted Bundy, who was on crutches, attempting to get help with the ski boots he was carrying. In the blink of an eye, she ran down to the pool, asking him if he needed help. He said yes, and with that, the two of them ventured off to the parking lot on the side of the inn. Once Bundy was sure they were out of sight from any witnesses, he hit her over the head with the boot and then dragged her into the car. He struck her over the head again, this time with the metal crowbar, and then he SA'd her in the vehicle. He then drove 2.8 miles away from Wildwood Inn to a location near Owl Creek Road. Here, he repeatedly struck her in the head with the crowbar, leaving her naked body in the snow. Karen would rest in that spot for nearly a month before being found. By the time she had been partially eaten by animals and her body was frozen. In fact, it took an entire 24 hours to thaw her body before an autopsy was even able to be performed on her. By this time, Bundy was long gone and had returned to Salt Lake City. Julie Cunningham. On March 15, 1975, Julie Cunningham, a part-time ski instructor, headed to a bar around 9 p.m. Before she got there, Ted Bundy would ask her for help, again using the same ruse as he did with Carol, gaining her sympathy with his crutches. She agreed, and so she accompanied him to his car. Once they reached the vehicle, Julie placed the boots in his VW Bug. Bundy seized the opportunity to strike her in the head with his crowbar, leaving her unconscious. He then placed her body in his car, handcuffed her, and then drove 90 miles out of the city to a rural spot in Rifle, Colorado. When he stopped the car, she regained consciousness. Unfortunately, Bundy took this time to SA and strangle her until she was once again out cold. At this point, he exited the vehicle, purposefully leaving the passenger side door open. Bundy patiently waited for her to regain consciousness. As he anticipated, she fled the car and ran off into the night. Her screams were heard by no one but him. He let her run for a short distance before sprinting after her and dragging her to the ground. Not long after, he wrapped his hands around Julie's throat and squeezed until he was sure she was dead. From here, he dragged the body through the wilderness, leaving it on the top of a hillside under a tree. 20 days later, Bundy would return here and bury the body in another location. Julie Cunningham would be yet another victim that would never be found. Denise Oliverson. On April 6, 1975, Denise Oliverson had an argument with her boyfriend. Attempting to cool off, she rode her bicycle through Grand Junction, Colorado to her parents' house. In order to get there, she'd have to cross a bridge leading over a river. Bundy never revealed how exactly he got her into his car. However, experts believe that he parked his car in her path and then bashed her in the skull with the crowbar once she came near. As usual, he'd drag her into his car and then drive off. Bundy would then drive on the I-70 toward Utah, and once he reached state lines, he would murder her, either with the crowbar or by strangulation. Regardless, he dumped her body in the Colorado River before heading back home. Like Julie, Denise's body has also never been found. Lynette Culver. On May 6, 1975, a 12-year-old girl by the name of Lynette Culver was having lunch at Alameda Junior High in Pocatello, Idaho. As she was leaving to go back to class, she would see Ted Bundy motion her over to his vehicle. After this, he somehow convinced her to get inside. She unfortunately did. Bundy sped off away from her middle school and to his hotel room at the Holiday Inn. Once inside, he would drown her in his hotel room bathtub and then SA her dead body. Following this, he would then drag her out of the Holiday Inn and into the trunk of his car. While a massive search ensued in the area for the missing girl, Bundy was driving miles away only to dump her body into a river. No one has ever found any trace of Lynette Culver. Susan Curtis. On June 27, 1975, 15-year-old Susan Curtis attended a university conference in Provo, Utah. She had just finished dinner and headed back to her room to brush her teeth. She would never be seen again. Ironically, Susan Curtis was at the same high school play on the same night that Deborah Kent, another Bundy victim, was kidnapped. Ted Bundy admitted to the murder of Susan only moments before his execution. According to him, he buried her body 75 miles away in Price, Utah. No trace of her has ever been found, and no details about this killing are known. Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, Karen Chandler, and Kathy Kleiner. On the night of January 14th, 1978, Ted Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. There he would go into the rooms of Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, Karen Chandler, and Kathy Kleiner, attacking them one by one. Earlier in the night, Bundy had attempted several other attacks on campus. As opposed to his other killings, he had a dark energy around him, causing him to make many careless mistakes he wouldn't have made otherwise. Still ruthless, the bloodlust within him had taken over. At this point, he was no longer cunning and sophisticated. He was consumed by his need to take human life. That's why, within that sorority house, he would attempt to murder multiple women. With his hand tightly gripping a wooden club, he would go from room to room, beating and SAing 4 sorority girls. 2 of them, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, would die from the attacks. After beating Margaret's face with the club, he would strangle her. In fact, he had wrapped his hands so tightly around her throat that he disjointed her neck. Her forehead and right ear bled profusely. Lisa Levy was found dead by investigators in another room. She'd been severely beaten with a club and strangled, just like Margaret. With this victim, Bundy would make a grave error. During his attack, he bit the buttocks of Lisa twice, imprinting his teeth marks in her flesh for investigators. After murdering Margaret and Lisa, Bundy would creep to another room which housed both Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. Kathy would hear the door open and a footstep. Moments later, when she opened her eyes, she would be met with a wooden club being brought down on her face. He then moved over to Karen, striking her as well. Bundy had beaten them so severely that the club lost most of its bark. Although they would live, both girls would have their jaws completely shattered. In fact, Kathy Chandler has stated she's had surgery on her jaw to correct issues from the attack as late as 2018. Luckily for the 2 sorority girls, car lights shined through the window. With blood still dripping from his club, he'd make his way down the stairs, creeping through the darkness of the sorority house and into the night outside. By this time, it was around 3:15 a.m. Unknown to Bundy, Nita Nearney, who entered the house just moments earlier, had seen him leave through the front door. Soon, the campus would be swarming with police and paramedics. Cheryl Thomas. After leaving the sorority house, Bundy would travel a few blocks away and into the apartment of a woman named Cheryl Thomas. Cheryl was also a student at Florida State University but lived off campus. After breaking into her home by crawling through a rear window, he bashed her skull and face with the club. This shattered her jaw and left her permanently deaf in one ear. Bundy then removed her clothing, preparing to SA her while strangling her from behind with a pair of pantyhose. His plan was for Cheryl to die as he had his way with her. However, this plan was soon foiled due to the neighbors calling out to her. From here, Bundy masturbated over her unconscious body as quickly as possible and then fled through the back window, again leaving DNA evidence for investigators. He then headed back to his residence. Later, Bundy would attend a meeting with others to discuss the murders. During the meeting, Bundy himself would state this was probably a professional job and this guy has done it before. Within 24 hours, Bundy had murdered 2 women and severely injured 3 others. Despite this, his killing spree was still not over. Kimberly Leach. On February 9, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach would walk through her school campus to get her purse. Bundy would soon approach Kimberly. It is unknown what he said to her. Andy Anderson, a firefighter, would witness this encounter, later stating that he saw Bundy leading the crying girl back to a van, shoving her inside and speeding off. Andy would explain that he thought it was a father taking his daughter back home. Bundy would drive 40 miles from the school to a national park. After finding a secluded area, he would remove her clothing and SA her. After this, he would come across a deserted hog shed. It was here that Bundy forced Kimberly to lie down on her stomach. He SA'd her again, only this time he removed a knife, slashing and repeatedly stabbing her neck. He would leave her body there, where it would be found decomposed 2 months later. After the murder, Bundy would leave the van on the outer city limits, wiping down the fingerprints but leaving other damning evidence behind. Kimberly Leach would be his final kill. The arrest of Ted Bundy. The day after murdering Kimberly Leach, Bundy was walking down Stadium Drive in Tallahassee when he was spotted by Officer Roy Dickey. Noticing the officer, Bundy dashed to another street, successfully evading certain arrest. While standing outside his apartment that night, Bundy would again be spotted by the same officer. Bundy at that time had a van full of stolen goods, which included a license plate. As the officer radioed in the license plate number, Bundy sprinted down an alleyway, once again evading arrest. A few days later, he would steal a VW Bug. Oddly enough, he would later state that he felt guilty about stealing the car. Despite being a pathological liar, it seems he was being honest as he did use the car to look for another one. Ultimately, he'd steal another Volkswagen and headed toward Alabama. Around 2:30 a.m. on February 15th, Bundy was sitting in his car smoking a joint while studying a map of Salt Lake City. Moments later, a bright light emitted from another vehicle. This startled Bundy and he soon sped off. Unfortunately for him, his mistake was leaving his headlights off. The other vehicle with the bright light was a police cruiser. Bundy continued, running 2 stop signs before eventually pulling over at a gas station. The officer, Sergeant Bob Hayward, stepped out of his cruiser and called more officers on scene. Bundy's car was searched and soon he was arrested for evading an officer. It wouldn't be long before they linked him to all the murders. Later, while being charged, he'd escape through a window of the courthouse library, walking around as a free man for 8 days. He'd be caught again, only to escape again as he was waiting for trial. Theodore Roberts Bundy would be eventually given the death sentence. He'd be held in the Florida State Prison until he was executed in the electric chair on January 24th, 1989. His last words would be, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Before being executed, he'd confessed to 30 murders. Experts, and even his lawyer, believe the actual count may have been in the hundreds. Ted Bundy refused to talk about murders if they fell under certain circumstances, and he may have committed his first killing as young as 14. Unfortunately, we may never know. Thank you for watching my video. Before doing research for this video, I wasn't aware of any of the details of Ted Bundy's killing spree. With that being said, I can really see why some people feel he had somewhat of a supernatural aura. The amount of times he should have been caught and the amount of times he escaped getting caught is unbelievable. Anyway, if you enjoy this type of content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell button so you'll be notified when new videos come out. Also, if you're interested in my novel, click the thumbnail on screen now for a sample reading. That's all I have for now. See you next time.